Today is New Year's Eve 2017, and I'm going to do a lot of things today. I've got a lot of things planned for today, some of them public-facing, some of them just associated with cleaning stuff up, getting ready for 2018. One of the things I'm not going to be doing probably is writing any long-form text, but I wanted to record a podcast associated with the paradoxes of writing long-form text, because it's something that I'm reflecting on very heavily currently, and I'm actually putting my time, in part, into writing long-form text. Now, in terms of my ability to create something that people will consume, podcasts are pretty high on the list. I know even if it's 100-odd people, which I think is probably the case with Longfunk. It's in that order. It's not in the tens, but it's in the low hundreds. In terms of producing audio, I know at least that I've reached that number of people in some way, and I know that in their day-to-day lives I've made some degree of impact. The other stuff that I do is create software. Now, obviously, in my day-to-day job, the work that I do there affects millions of people. I don't think that's a trade secret. And in that light, I'm not impacting them in any way associated with my ideas or these kind of things, just enabling them to access content. I feel good about that. Then, in addition to these things, I have music, which currently is really only for my own benefit. I've talked about releasing music and thought about releasing music and spent some time in that direction. But the ability to actually pull the trigger on music is, I don't know, you need to do a variety of things. It needs to be a certain state, and then you release it. Today, first thing in the morning, having shown my wife, I released some of the Cityscape, or at least the video of it. The source code's all available. People could download the source code, run the source code, create their own random cityscapes already. I've been working on it for a number of years, and the source code's been publicly accessible through that entire period of time. But with regards to software that I create, it doesn't have the same immediate reach as audio, but it certainly reaches a similar number of people, and in fact, probably a greater number of people over time, depending on the release method. That's an interesting caveat, so let's look into that for a minute. Software for me, in terms of what I release publicly, is almost all my after-hours software work is public-facing. Very few things are not public-facing, but being public-facing and being used by the public are two separate things. So software does require some additional stuff. It's not just a matter of editing audio and putting it out. And I do like to maintain a certain level of quality, although people that see the Cityscape environment might have a series of qualms associated with that. I like to have software that is going out that is of a certain level, so most of it is public-facing, but I will do internal, work and then push it public-facing occasionally. Very rarely, actually. But still, it requires people to download software, in some cases compile software. This is very different than just having an audio file appear in your listening device. And in contrast to this, there is writing. And writing for me is a formalized process. Both my parents have written. My father exclusively non-fiction, my mother non-fiction and fiction. And within Australia, my mother has actually received a number of accolades for her writing. I mean, my father's writing is very well known as well in his particular academic field. But to see the trajectory, the downward trajectory of writing as a means of getting not only professional acclaim, but just, a good sense that people actually read the stuff that you're producing. Watching my mother's trajectory down has been a subject of my life, in actual fact. I mean, seeing the difficulty that my mother has associated with agency and publishing in general, and just, the nature of what has happened with books is very curious, because what you see here is the dying of a media. And 99% of what I say about writing is in a negative light. So you might wonder, why would I choose to adopt this for any period of my creative time? That is a very critical and very interesting question, which I've explored. I will now give you a brief view of my thinking on this. There are certain modes of media which are omnipresent currently. Most of them are still visual media. Almost all of them are produced media, and they all come through a means where people can easily access them. Now, you have films, You have music, which you pay for, but there's a lot of free media out there as well, which is competing for people's time. And then you've got things like network television, which is free-ish, I guess. Anyway. But all of these media forms still come through writing. There are a few of them that are less associated with writing, but almost all of them are based on the written word. And when you read the quality of the written word that produces a lot of this stuff, you start to wonder, how do people get into this mechanism where their written word is converted into films and series and the kinds of things that people popularly consume. And this is a paradox that I've looked into for many years, because I've thought to myself, I could write sufficient to get into these forms, but here's the caveat. What is the quality of the ideas that I want to put out in these forms? And is the quality of the ideas, not the quality of the ideas, is the kind of ideas that I want to put out in these forms fundamentally against the nature of the forms? Now, I've recorded a previous Long Funk on this topic where I just talked about the 3 extended works of writing that I'm working on currently. But I wanted to give this initial introduction to give some sense of why I'm doing this thing, as opposed to, for example, editing and getting out model rail radio, which I will be doing also today, top on the list of things to do. So within these ideas, writing has always struck me as being the simmering idea, simmering method, let's say, where if something occurs, it will spark and flame up greater than software and greater than audio. And in terms of my time pursuits, I'm going to spend more time this year writing. Now, let's talk a little bit about the writing process. Putting out software, I do instinctively, but it enables me to do lots and lots of piecemeal work, then actually publicizing something for a short period of time, and then lots and lots of piecemeal work, and then getting to a release where I can publicize it. That's one method. Recording audio and putting out audio is very much associated with ongoing production. It's associated with creating the audio, editing the audio, and putting it out. It's somewhat dependent on the kind of audio. Multiple speakers, more than 2, always take more time and always take more effort. And this is something I've learnt very quickly. Well, it's something I've learnt quickly but acknowledged slowly, associated with the podcasts that I record. That multi-participant audio has always taken me a little bit longer to put out. And also, there's a quality issue as well associated with multi-participant audio. When you are working with one other person over a long period of time, the audio that's created is typically pretty good. You can work through various speech tics that they have, or I can work through various speech tics that I have. The way that audio comes out through this mechanism can be refined relatively quickly, so the editing process is not time-consuming. When you take calls, and you take calls from a wide variety of folk that have a wide variety of different speech tics that you have to edit out, it's more time-consuming. And it's something I realized that my burden on the audio, burden is a strange word to use here, but my interaction with the audio is very much dependent on the kind of quality of time that I have to spend with the audio in order to get it out. Writing for me is more like software production fundamentally, except it's like software production without actually the release component. The release component is very long term. So you get very little feedback associated with the process, and it's actually quite time consuming. I've used dictation software, gone a slightly faster rate with the dictation software, but the dictation software also introduces errors and modes of error, which I find myself having to work around through the text, which is a very strange way of doing it. So I've returned to fingers on a keyboard typing, usually creating a skeleton and then filling in the skeleton. It's still time consuming, and it's time consuming in a way where I think audio I can get out. Audio, I've got a pretty good indication that I'm going to get the audio out. Software a little bit more tortured in some regard, but I'm still going to put the releases out. And the software that I put out fundamentally exists in publicly accessible source code, so people can at least find the source code after the fact. Text is very different. Text is, until it's actually released, and I have a lot of text that I've never released. And I think that's another barrier associated with this thing, which I'm reflecting on very heavily. But I'm putting more time into writing text within the next year, and I've already put some time into it currently. There are 3 text projects I'm working on. The first is associated with getting Noble Apes into a city environment. What I'm working on currently in software terms, I think also is a relatively interesting exploratory text. And I think that also has the least barrier for entry associated with it being released and actually being read. When you write text, you always want it to be read. When you record audio, you always want it to be listened to. When you create software, you always want it to be used. All these things have different ratios, different percentages, different means of people actually acquiring it to people using it. And I'm very sensitive to these kind of fractions that exist. With regards to text, even after purchasing, even after gifting, even after the person receives the text, them sitting down and reading it is a huge barrier for entry. But I think with Noble Apes in the City, this is something that people will read, probably, at least as a curio. They might not read all of it, they might only read sections, they might skip read it. But if I release it, I think there's going to be an audience that will come to it at some stage. This is the other thing with text. It has a very, very, very long tail. But within that exploration, there's lots of narrative and lots of ideas that I've never really talked about with Noble Ape. Certainly as I talk about Noble Ape more in podcast form and these kind of things currently, I reflect on little bits and pieces that I've never really actively explicitly talked about, which is quite curious. You always have a narrative associated with these kind of projects, and when you're asked questions, you present the narrative. And within that format, there's a problem associated with actually acknowledging little things that you only think about after the fact, like, wasn't it curious that this thing happened because that thing happened? These kind of ideas, which comes through reflective thinking, which is never the case when you're on BBC Radio 4. You're on BBC Radio 4, you've got a set of existing topics and discussion points and touch points that'll seem interesting, but you're not going to be reflecting on eclectic little bits and pieces. So within this writing, but also associated with speaking and speaking publicly and recording audio and a bunch of other things, I've come to a few ideas in Noble Ape that I've never really explored before. And some of this may or may not work in text form, but again, as I've noted, people are considerably, I don't know, well, my sense at least, maybe this is just the way I consume text, but people will skip text and keep reading and miss bits and they don't count. The second piece of writing that I'm working on currently is associated with a road trip. And I had a road trip idea, which I've been kind of floating and writing various skeletal things to, but I think the nature of road trip in novel form is so quintessentially American and also so beautiful as a means of exploring interleaving themes, which is something I've always liked with regards to extended writing as well. That you can have different characters with different themes and their interaction produces a gestalt, which is more than the sum of the parts. And through this writing, it enables me to expand upon and explore a number of the things that I found really interesting in the road trip that I recently undertook. So there is a time frame associated with getting this stuff downloaded from my brain, and it's already slightly out of that time frame. I've got some scattered notes, some locations, these kind of things, but weaving the themes, weaving the ideas of the various characters through these time frames and these locations, this is the interesting part of the process associated with this text. And I think similar to the Noble Ape text, this is something that people will be relatively receptive to. It's less work in some regard than a technical book on Noble Ape, and it's something that people might just find fun. Let's try and throw that idea out there. So that, in and of itself, is something that I return to periodically in my writing. I should talk about writing as an emotion as well. I need to be in a very particular mind state before I actually start writing text, and I have kind of two phases of this. I have the note-jotting mind state, and then I have the extended writing mind state. And getting to the extended writing mind state is less likely than the note-jotting mind state. I need to be in a very particular place to do this. I'd feel the same way associated with editing Model Rail Radio. I need to be in a very particular place to actually sit down and edit that. And increasingly, I'm familiar with what state I need to be in to actually do this stuff justice, which is ultimately what I look for when I'm doing extended writing. So I'm typically only ever doing this on weekends, sometimes in the evenings, but usually through my workday life, it's difficult to find evenings where I'm in exactly the right state of mind to be writing, which is one of the reasons I have 3 projects that I'm working on in writing form. The final project that I'm working on, which actually, when I recorded this as a test record, I spent the most time exploring, is started by the biography that is yet to be published associated with the phone hacker John Draper. And it's also a little exploration of how I've gotten somehow, strangely, curiously involved in this Me Too phenomena, which ultimately I guess I've explored more thoroughly through This Comes Next. And if you want more discussion associated with this, This Comes Next is probably your better audio source. But the writing associated with Crunch was to talk about a story which I have told, not a story which I've told, actual events which occurred associated with the phone hacker, which have comedically continued on. The idea that ideas can carry on through their comedic intent, an ability to talk about something which normally would be socially shunned, perhaps disagreed with, these kind of things. If you could talk about it with a certain degree of comedy and humor, it will continue as an idea. And this is what the John Draper writing is about fundamentally. It's about taking an experience that I had when I was 18, talking about it in a comedic fashion, and then carrying on the idea. And it's so much part of John Draper as a person, because I'm not alone in this experience, many other people who had very similar experiences, that I wanted to test the water with this writing to see how this writing would be received, with the view that there is a longer form piece of writing associated with this particular topic and idea that I wanted to write upon. And here I'm talking specifically associated with, I don't even know how one would put it out in podcast form. I almost want to go back to the original recording that I did with this thing and talk about it a bit more. But basically, it's associated with the nature of like physical interactions, technology, well, not necessarily even really technology, but the notion of male grooming as part of a variety of not even really underground networks. I mean, the explicit nature of this thing as it pertains to young men, in some cases boys, in some cases children, and what comes out of this in terms of an evolution of a society. And this is a very difficult topic to explore. This is something which is beyond heady in some regard. And actually, what I'm interested in seeing through this Me Too phenomena, and also through how this Crunch book is received, is what maturity the society is in for this kind of conversation. Because I don't think this is a conversation that could have even been had a couple of years ago. It's very interesting to think about the transition of, I don't know, intellectual discussion associated with these things. Now, the Crunch book, before it even came out, has already received a lot of really curious publicity. And I should point out here, I've maintained, not necessarily a friendship, but I've maintained connections with Crunch. And I've done this primarily because he knew me when I was in Australia, and the nature of our interaction is now prefaced on me, as an adult. And in that regard, I also think that my relationship with other people that have known Crunch are also prefaced on this idea. I'm very close friends with, in terms of the fact that he's stayed with me in multiple locations, the author Craig Wilson. I think he goes by Fraser Wilson or Wilson Fraser. Anyway, Craig, as I know him, who is the co-author of the Crunch biography. And in that light, and in fact, I contribute a lot of text for the Crunch biography, of which I think only about 2,000 words were used. I contribute about 5,000 words. So within this thing, there was also an amount of negative publicity that has been generated by Crunch through Me Too, in some regard, I think. If I was to put my finger on something, it would be that. And what interests me about this is the nature of journalism is so completely superficial and so completely curious. We have on one side a potentially powerful outing social phenomena, and on the other side, journalists that can't be bothered to do their job. Like, it looks like they're doing their job, but they're not actually doing their job in some really curiously fundamental sense. And what comes through this is the need for additional people, folks such as myself, to write about these things and to put it out. Now, I should probably caveat this by saying I don't necessarily know whether I'm the right person for this thing. But what I know is that the journalists are not doing their jobs associated with actually digging into this a little bit more. And there's certain things that have occurred through this period which I think have just been completely missed in some media sense. So my interest in doing this writing is to write about experiences that I've had that lead me towards the sense that this, I don't know, that these things are not even really under the surface. Like the notion of grooming and the behaviors that go on through this process are pretty explicit and pretty culturally ingrained, but at the same point very curious and in need of serious additional analysis. And that's what I'm trying to do in this third writing, is to explore this with a certain degree of analysis. And also to explore the notion that perhaps, not necessarily that humor is the best way to discuss this stuff, but actually there are some important discussions that need to be had, particularly associated with power structures and grooming, which are not, well, historically anyway, have not been able to be discussed. So this is a very different book. This is not a book like Noble Apes in the City or a road trip book. This is a book that explores social phenomena in a way which could be dangerous in a variety of different ways. It could be dangerous in a professional sense, it could be dangerous in a public perception sense, it could be something that would be very detrimental if it was done incorrectly. And in that light, it is probably the least likely of the three to see the light of day, but there are things that are coming up. Firstly, the reception of the Crunch book, but also how the other text is received, which makes this a piece of writing that is continuing to be interesting to me. It's also something I reflect upon, that what I do with podcasts in particular, and what I do in general, I'm a recluse. I mean, in terms of the way I live, I don't see people. I've been watching recently with my wife Curb Your Enthusiasm, and I started to realize that these kind of adventures, these social adventures that at least a portion of the population have, I don't have. I don't have immediate friends. I don't go out in social circumstances. I'm going to recultivate perhaps a relationship with the local train club. But in general, when I'm not at work, I'm at home working on my ideas and producing audio and doing this kind of stuff, software, text, audio, music. And these are the things that I do. This is my life. So the ability to have social interactions and to run ideas past people, I've tried these topics, in particular the third novel topic, in a way where I can get a barometer of how this thing would be received. But until you actually put it out, until it's out for social scrutiny, you're in a completely different position. It's really quite astounding to me how I've done certain things where I think, this might be a point of interest, absolutely no interest. I mean, Noble Ape is a good example of this. 3+ years of development before any critical, positive writing came out about Noble Ape. But I continued to work on it. I continued to let it simmer. It was continued development up until this day. And I think the nature of all these projects is you just have to continue to maintain them until a point where someone says, this is interesting. And with writing, I've never really had that experience. I mean, I've written academic stuff, which people cite and this kind of thing. I mean, but it's not the same thing. It's not a long-standing set of ideas that are coming out and being accessible to a lot of people. So this is what returns me to writing periodically. And I should point out, there's actually writing that I have that is available currently. I mean, it's not that I'm talking out of no experience with this thing. I have a novella, and I've got the original manuals of Noble Ape, and I've got a wide variety of academic writing that I've done, and occasionally some popular writing as well. The popular writing actually is done well out of everything that I've done. Here I'm talking, again, not hugely popular, but I wrote an article for H+, now 8 years ago, 9 years ago, as the clock turns. And that did quite well. I mean, certainly O'Reilly, who does the O'Reilly books, and the technical books with the animals on the cover, he liked that writing. And I thought, well, that's interesting, popular writing. Maybe this is another vehicle. But for now, it's long-form writing, it's long-form descriptive writing, and we'll see how it turns out. My aim was to be relatively ambitious and to get something out within the first quarter of 2018. I don't know if that's going to happen, but you never know. I think at least by the third quarter, one of these things should come to fruition. But you should reflect also as you listen to this audio that this is one of a few things that I am working on. And I'm giving a certain degree of positive attention to Long Funk currently, because I think it's an interesting vehicle to explore ideas. And that is motivating a lot of my input into this thing. But maybe other things will come up. I mean, certainly my professional life always comes up. So let us see if I can maintain the weekly pace, the weekly cadence that I've done so far with this particular audio recording. Tom Barbalet sitting in a podcasting room, which as well, this is the non-public facing part of today, I'm going to be doing hopefully a lot of work in. Signing out.